Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth of our webinar series on reducing uncertainties and raising awareness of clean fuels. We are pleased to present today's webinar focused on Regional Hall with Carolyn Kim, Cindy Bailey, and Robert Stasko. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the work we do spans across many nations. We acknowledge the space our organization is headquartered in includes the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The lands are also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. We share these acknowledgements in a spirit of truth, justice, and reconciliation. Our webinar series looks at alternative fuels for different vehicle classes and asks panelists with real-world experience their perspective on the transition and how they perceive the challenges and opportunities. There are multiple options out there for operators, and we want to bring some clarity into this space. We will open the webinar by having the panelists respond to our key question, followed by some moderator questions. We will then open the floor to the audience for questions. Please make sure to submit all questions for the panelists in the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screen and indicate whether you are directing the question to all the panelists or to a specific panelist. If you encounter any technical difficulties, don't hesitate to send a message in the chat and one of our team members will be available to help. Lastly, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded for future reference. There will be a post-webinar survey that will be prompted after the webinar and sent out again tomorrow. Please let us have your thoughts. I would like to present our panelists for today's webinar. First, we have Ms. Carolyn Kim, who is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs at UPS, where she leads the work on the energy transition. Before joining UPS, she was the Senior Director of the Communities and Decarbonization Group here in Pembina. Cindy Bailey is the Head of Corporate Sustainability in Purolator. Since 2001, she has worked with stakeholders to achieve significant progress towards Purolator's interim goals, including its goal to reduce Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 42% by 2030. Robert Stasko is the Executive Director of the Hydrogen Business Council and affiliate of the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association. He's an energy technology specialist who has held management positions in R&D, product development, market analysis, and collaborative pilot projects. Before we dive into our key question for today, I would like to ask our panelists to set the context for the conversation and to provide some insight into their organization's perspective on the energy transition and their approach to alternative fuels within their operations. Carolyn, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks, Hung-Yu, and good to be with Robert and Cindy as my fellow panelists. Looking forward to the conversation today. If you may not know, UPS is a multinational global company in transportation and logistics, and I would say this is a really timely discussion, especially we're seeing a lot of change globally and in Canada on the energy policy side of things. And there's a myriad of technologies, different low carbon solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and tackle climate change. For us as a global company with more than 200 country footprint, we've seen firsthand how climate change and air quality and socioeconomic challenges intersect. And so we're proud to have 100% carbon neutrality by 2050 goal. And of course, that includes a number of different clear plans and targets. So I'll mention a few before we kick off the discussion. When it comes to our alternative fuels and the use on the ground, we have a target of meeting 40% alternative fuels by 2025. So that's coming up in short order. Of course, we also look to how we're powering our facilities, and we have a target of meeting a 25% renewable electricity powering our facilities by 2035, and that's scaling up to, 2025, and that's scaling up to 100% by 2035. We also have targets related to the use of sustainable aviation fuel. And so our target there is 30% throughout our air network by 2035. Overall, we want to reduce our emissions by 50% per package delivered by 2035. So I think I just wanted to set the context to say that our decarbonization strategy is comprehensive and will require a lot of consideration depending on the needs in each jurisdiction. So more to come around our long haul commercial fleet operations.
Thank you, Carolyn. Cindy?
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here today and having us. I'm really excited for this discussion. So just to share a little bit about Purolator, for those of you who don't know, Purolator is a Canadian company. We do have operations both in Canada and US, but all of our last mile delivery is here in Canada. So a couple of years ago, we set some very ambitious goals around climate change and decarbonization of our business. And since then, we've been working really hard to come up with credible plans and science-based targets to make sure that we're going to be able to achieve these things. So the first thing that we're working on, of course, is our net zero goal by 2050. But more importantly, we've set some interim goals that we're working towards to ensure that we can decarbonize our operations. So the first thing that we're working on is electrifying our last mile delivery vehicles. And to do that, we're going to put over 3,500 all electric trucks on the road by 2030. But to get to our bigger target, our scope 1 and 2 target to reduce our emissions by 42%, we're going to need to do some other things as well. And that's in part what we're going to talk about here today. As we look at regional haul, what are some of those other solutions that we are tackling and that we have in place to make sure that we can get to this goal? So some of the things that we're going to be focusing on as an organization is renewable fuels, which we'll talk about today. So renewable diesel, also putting in place other low carbon solutions like mobile carbon capture, and of course, looking at electrification for our heavy duty vehicles as well. So happy to be here today and share a little bit about the technologies and strategies that we're deploying.
Thank you, Cindy. And Robert, please.
Hi, and thank you for putting me on this panel. And I'll just go right into it and mention that the Hydrogen Business Council is actually an organization here in Ontario that delivers a conference on hydrogen every year. We've had successful conferences now for 6 years, some of them virtual during COVID, and we had a very successful one in November, and we're planning another one for October. But we've also started a new organization here in Ontario called Hydrogen Ontario. And Hydrogen Ontario is an affiliate of the national organization, the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association, and they have a national reach from coast to coast. So they have an affiliate in BC, in Alberta, one here in Ontario now, and soon to have one in the Atlantic provinces. So we're basically looking at things at the provincial level, where energy issues and policies are very different from one to the next, and then writ large across the country, policies that would affect us all around hydrogen at the top level of the federal government. So that's the context of the organizations I work for, because frankly, I'm part of both. So what's the plan here? Why hydrogen? First of all, let me say right up front, I've been involved in emerging energy technologies for many, many years, including batteries. So when you come to electrification writ large, batteries make a lot of sense in some applications, many applications. Hydrogen, just to context, hydrogen is actually an electric fuel, because when it goes into a hydrogen-powered vehicle, it's basically an electric platform. But instead of a battery, you use a fuel cell, and you fuel it with hydrogen rather than charging it overnight. So when you look at electrification writ large, both hydrogen and batteries have a role to play. And our own feeling is that at the light end, at the light duty, it's probably going to be battery heavy. At the heavy end, where you're running vehicles 24/7 and you can't have them plugged in, hydrogen has a space. And I'll just stop right there and let the questions come in later.
Thank you very much, Robert. And so I think that's a great starting off point for our panelists' key question today, which is about the distinctive features of regional haul vehicles that create a business case for the use of alternative fuels.
Perhaps I'll kick it off but look forward to hearing from Cindy and Robert. For UPS, about almost 95% of our fleets and the routes that we run are about 170 kilometers or less. So when we talk about regional haul vehicles, these are typically vehicles that travel about 500 miles in a day. And these are Class 8 vehicles. So for us, when we think about our low carbon fuel strategy, there's a couple of factors that we consider. Number one, what is our operational requirements and needs in that particular region and jurisdiction? Reliability and convenience, of course, availability of infrastructure, potential for GHG emission reductions, and how does that improve air quality? A big factor is financial and social responsibility. And then, of course, the policy and regulatory compliance in that particular jurisdiction. For UPS, we don't bet on one particular solution. It's diverse. We do include electrification, but we also consider renewable diesel, compressed natural gas, and renewable natural gas as well. So what I will say is, for many years in the past, we've also used propane as a part of our alternative fuel solution, but we're pivoting away from that now that we've learned that it didn't deliver the carbon emission reductions that we hoped for. So I think the future is bright in terms of the potential for the low carbon fuel space. And I'll just kind of leave it there and pass it over to perhaps Cindy and Robert for their thoughts on this.
Great. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say you next.
Yeah, happy to give some thoughts on this. And, I would agree with both Robert and Carolyn when they, have both spoke about the fact that there isn't any one technology or alternative fuel that's going to get us there. I think from our perspective at Purolator as well, like it really is going to be a combination of many different types of technologies and alternative fuels that we're going to need to have in the toolbox in order to achieve these really aggressive targets that we've set for ourselves. So when we talk specifically about regional haul, similar to UPS, for Purolator, of course, this is our heavy duty vehicles as well that are going longer distances. So electrification really hasn't been a good use case for us here when we talk about these vehicles. It does make a lot of sense for us for our last mile delivery vehicles that are typically traveling less than 100 kilometers a day. And financially, it makes sense with these vehicles as well. But what we're finding with the heavy duty vehicles is that from a price standpoint, we're not there yet. So we're still finding that these vehicles are about 3 times or more the cost of a traditional ICE tractor. Also, there's a lot of concerns and challenges around infrastructure. So we've been looking to other solutions to figure out how are we going to bridge the gap while we're waiting for electric tractors and hydrogen for the market to evolve and more infrastructure to be in place. So one of the things we've been looking to for now is renewable diesel. This has been a great solution for us out in BC. So in our lower BC mainland, we actually have 3 terminals out there, which all of our Class 8 heavy duty tractors operate out of. And last year, we were able to bring in renewable diesel to this location. And we were actually able to bring in R100, so 100% renewable diesel blend. Because of this, we've actually seen significant emissions reduction coming out of that region. The other really great things about renewable diesel is that it's a drop-in ready fuel. So no change to our operations, no concerns from the operators, not really any issues from a seasonal perspective at this point. And we can get up to an 80 to 85% reduction in our emissions from this fuel. In addition to this, we are looking at biodiesel as well. Now, this has a few more challenges. Of course, you're not going to get the same emissions reduction. However, it is quite available. It is available at the same price point as traditional diesel. But there are concerns, of course, that are still lingering around the use of this fuel in vehicles. So it's a little bit more difficult to convince our operators to use this fuel. And there is the seasonal aspect that needs to be considered. So can really only be used between May and September in many areas. But in addition to the renewable diesel, we're also looking at other short-term solutions while, again, we're waiting for things to advance with hydrogen and electric for these vehicles. Another thing that we're considering is hybrid technologies with hydrogen. So there are certain areas and regions within Canada where there are some options available to pilot hydrogen hybrid technology. So that's something we're considering. Another option that we're looking at in the shorter term is mobile carbon capture. So this is a device that we can put onto our heavy duty equipment to capture and store the CO2. So there's quite a few options that we're playing around with and bringing into our roadmap and our strategy. One thing, Carolyn mentioned was the need to continue to evolve and be open and flexible to all the potential solutions and technologies that are out there. So that's something we're continuing to do, year over year as this market continues to mature. Rob, over to you.
Thank you. So I agree with Cindy's approach here, and I think Carolyn as well, that it's really too soon to see that there's a silver bullet that's going to answer all of our decarbonization issues around transportation. And the markets are evolving. And one of the themes that came up is infrastructure. The infrastructure is not there. The infrastructure is evolving too. And that's for electrification, both on the pure electric battery charging side and on the hydrogen production side, because right now, most of our hydrogen here in Eastern Canada comes from electrolysis, where you use electricity, some hopefully off peak when it makes economic sense to make hydrogen. And we're using that in some transportation pilots here in Ontario. But honestly, when you look at the arc of requirements for the grid to expand to meet all of our electrification demands, we are going to be stressing out our grids big time right across the country, especially in places like Ontario. I used to be a nuclear engineer. That's what I did for many, many years. And back in the 80s, we were commissioning a multi-unit station every 5 years. So I know that it's feasible to expand our grid at that pace, but I know that it may not be economic to do so. So when we're looking at specifically electrification writ large, it's going to be a challenge. If I'm looking at just hydrogen electric, the challenge there too is on top of all this electrification demand on our grid, we pancake electrification for hydrogen production solely for that. That's going to be an additional demand that we're struggling to see where it's going to come from. So I'm just going to pivot a bit and mention that there's another source of hydrogen, several. We can get hydrogen by pyrolyzing waste streams like wood waste, plastic waste, bio waste. We can also make hydrogen through pyrolysis of methane. There are other ways. The way we make hydrogen from methane right now, frankly, is very high in CO2 emission. But if you use a technology called pyrolysis, which is expanding very rapidly, we can actually produce hydrogen with low carbon intensity from methane. And so there will be other sources of hydrogen looking forward. And my feeling is that if we go out far enough, it's going to be mostly clean fuels like hydrogen and electricity that dominate. But in the transition to that, the hybrids that Cindy mentioned, the biofuels that Carolyn mentioned, and the renewable diesel, these have a role to play during the transition, in my view.
I think I might add one more thing. When it comes to our fleets, and we have about 3,000, fleet, our fleet is about 3,000 in Canada. I should say that our package cars are perhaps larger than other last mile delivery vehicles. We use Class 6 vehicles. And so when it comes to electrification and our low carbon fuel strategy, we have to think about also what suits a larger vehicle. The NRCan's new incentive program for medium and heavy duty vehicles is a really great incentive for zero tailpipe emission vehicles, but I think the uptake is mainly for the smaller vehicles like Class 2B, 3. Cindy, I'm actually curious to know what size of vehicles Purolator uses for the last mile deliveries. But I think that's something that is a big consideration for UPS in terms of our strategy. It's like our package cars that you see on our city roads are larger. So that's why we also use options like CNG and renewable diesel, and with an eye towards RNG as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Carolyn, because definitely some of these last mile vehicles get into the larger class. For us, we're primarily between Class 2B and Class 5 for our last mile. But we do consider in our target to get to 60% electrification. We are also including our straight trucks. So that would be Class 6 as well. So yeah, everything really up to a Class 6, but the focus has been more so on some of the smaller vehicle models to start. Right now, we've deployed 3 different vehicle models. So anything from a cargo van, so the 40 Transit, which would be more the 2B, all the way up to our Motive step van, which would be a class 5. So, but you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot to be considered there as you get into some of the larger class vehicles.
Okay, thank you. And we already have quite a few audience questions, so I just jump straight to them. Very popular questions for Cindy here. I think if you wanted to respond to the first question about EPA 2027, bringing major changes for diesel engine manufacturers, and whether renewable diesel is there for a long-term solution, and if our other panelists want to contribute as well, please feel free.
Sure. So, sorry, just to reiterate, the question is asking if we see renewable diesel as a long-term solution. Is that correct?
Yes, and if you could also, I guess, respond to the second question there, I think is related about the source of the figure for the 85% emissions reductions with renewable diesel.
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of the sources, I can certainly share some different sources after the call today. Depending on the feedstock and of course the location in which the diesel is coming from, the renewable diesel, the percentage is going to change pretty considerably. Out in BC, we have implemented an R100 blend, as I mentioned. So we are getting much higher emissions reduction out of that fuel. We're currently in the process of implementing R20 in our Montreal area, but unfortunately that's just going to be an R20 blend. Still significant emissions reduction, but far less than our other location. For us, in terms of renewable diesel use, I would say at this point, we see it more as a short and medium term solution. So we are continuing at this point to buy heavy duty ICE vehicles. And of course, when we buy those vehicles, they are going to be on the road for, 10 plus years. So I would say this is going to have to be an important part of the solution for us for many years to come yet. But certainly, as things evolve and the market improves, we will begin to transition over to hydrogen electric vehicles. And then if there are any other technologies that come to the market, we do have plans right now to begin transitioning some regional haul tractors to electric in a couple years' time. So the roadmap that I spoke about to 2030, we do have about 25 electric tractors built into that roadmap. And of course, looking at locations and distances where we can probably travel from one terminal to another terminal in one trip. So focusing more on the shorter trips in the beginning. But yes, I would say this is probably more of a short or medium term solution, but I won't say for sure because we're open to whatever the future holds. Was there anything else, Hongyu, on that question? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. I don't think so. Carolyn, if you wanted to respond to that as well.
I would say, in terms of our CNG and RNG use, we do see it as a short-term and long-term play for decarbonization. And as a global company, we do have experience with CNG and RNG and found some significant success with RNG in California. So when we look at our biggest markets, such as the US, especially RNG from dairy has been an eloquent kind of solution for us. We've seen how the low carbon fuel standard has helped the market develop. And so it shows us what the art of the possible is in terms of, signaling market growth and building out infrastructure to support that low carbon fuel use for the hardest to decarbonize part in the transportation sector. So I'm hopeful that the clean fuel regulation in Canada, although it's quite new, once it's fully established and the credit market takes off, we can see how the market can respond and for the infrastructure to develop. So I think that's why we see it as a short-term and longer-term play.
Thank you. And if you wanted to respond as well to the question about whether you see CNG stations to be more efficient in a private or a public network scenario.
For us, we do have, when we have CNG vehicles on the road, both in BC or Ontario, we have a mix of, public, like fueling our vehicles in public stations. And as long as it's close to our facilities, then I think it offers an efficient kind of model. I think if we're talking about on-site fueling, it certainly adds to the cost of the infrastructure build out. We're keeping an eye on regulations that affect the how CNG vehicles are housed in our facilities, and that may add some additional costs in terms of how you ventilate and the HVAC system. So we're mindful of how regulations can play a part in whether or not these options are financially viable or not. So there's a lot of moving pieces, but that's something that we're also monitoring.
Thank you. So the next question is not a question, but a message about the need for alternative solutions of diversity. But I do want to tack on a question to that, I think maybe to all the panelists here, which is from an operational perspective, does having multiple types of fuel, how does that work? In terms of maintenance, in terms of repair, in terms of infrastructure support. I mean, I'm sure it's a lot easier if all the trucks run on the same fuel as opposed to having multiple fuels. So how does that then work? And maybe even for smaller operators who don't have the resources of UPS and Purolator, who are then struggling with saying, okay, it's a multi-fuel solution, but how am I supposed to support multiple trucks running on different things? There's all kinds of makes things more complex, I'm sure. If you share a little bit about your experience there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to kick us off. I mean, when we're talking about specifically about the renewable diesel, for us, in order to make this happen, we did need to have a certain amount of volume. And in our case out in BC, where we have our 3 terminals where we're using this fuel currently, in order to get that volume and also to make this feasible, we did have to switch over all the fuel use in all 3 of these locations. We have a provider that actually brings the fuel to site for us and fuels the trucks. So we don't have any fuel storage tanks on site. So for us, it was a relatively easy changeover. And one of the things I just want to add on to Carolyn's comment. So she mentioned a little bit about the clean fuel standards and the low carbon fuel standard in BC. For us, this is really what's made this possible. So because we have the low carbon fuel standard in BC and the new Canadian fuel standard, clean fuel standard that's come in as well, there are incentives in both that can be stacked, which is what has driven down the price of renewable diesel for us in BC. So we're able to actually get this fuel now at about 2 cents more per liter than the traditional diesel. So very affordable. Unfortunately, this sort of situation of multiple incentives being stacked upon each other doesn't exist anywhere else in Canada. So we're seeing that the cost in Canada to get this fuel, although it is produced and available in Canada now, it's quite expensive. So we had a conversation just the other day with one of the refineries that just came online in BC in November. And we're looking at in other provinces about an extra 95 cents per liter to bring this fuel. So I just wanted to put that out there that, BC is a great place to start in terms of this fuel. But from an efficiency perspective, I think, switching all the vehicles that you have over and making sure that you can meet the minimum volume requirements is certainly going to be part of what you need to make this happen.
Thanks, Cindy. Carolyn, if you have any thoughts.
Not much more to add to that in terms of how we see the role of alternative fuels in the short and long term. Right, we're learning in terms of how to maintain and get everybody ready for our electric vehicles. So we're really excited to bring some new vehicles online this year with the help of the incentive program that has been a huge lift for UPS here. And of course, there's learning moments. And so we're hopefully, next year, this time we can bring some good insights on how we see the performance in cold weather climates in Canada. Of course, we have experience in the States, but to see how they operate in Canada will be really, I'm thrilled to learn about how they do. But certainly training and making sure that everybody's up to speed with the different requirements to help with our different fuel options is a big aspect. But is it easier just to go with one fuel because it's from a training perspective, that's probably a too simplified approach. Again, it's what's going to meet our business needs and maintain that operational excellence. And so there's so many different factors at play. Number one is reliability, being able to serve our customers as efficiently as possible is a really big driver for us.
And maybe if I could just add to that, when we talk about electrification, of course, as an alternative fuel as well. So in those cases, the terminals that we're electrifying, we're not going to 100% electrification in most cases. And, going back to Carolyn's point about reliability and use cases, in most of our terminals, we do still have routes that cannot be met by an electric vehicle at this time. So it is going to be a combination of both in those cases. And, just also, picking up on the point there about training and communication and buy-in, when you are operating two different kind of technologies out of the same location, there's a lot of different factors that come into place. So I think really strong, change management and communication is really necessary to make that a success.
Thank you. The next question is about the alternative fuel availability. I know, Cindy, you've already talked a little bit about this. I wonder if you could expand upon it, if there's anything to expand on. And it's actually one point I wanted to ask Carolyn about in particular was, the target 45%, I believe, by 2025. As I understand it, most jurisdictions in Canada at least are only targeting maximum 5 to 10% mix of RNG in their natural gas supply um by 2030, and that's the most ambitious goals. So how do you then align what jurisdictions are doing with the supply of RNG that is anticipated to be out there?
For us, it's 40% alternative fuels in our ground operations by 2025. So your question is around how do we negotiate with what's out there in terms of supply? I think, again, I want to reference California because there's been many supportive policies, including the LCFS, to support the build out of RNG infrastructure. And as a result of that, we have seen RNG use as a transportation fuel increase by 169% over the last 5 years. But at the same time, I think I just read in a McKinsey study that in the US, RNG supply needs to triple over the next decade to meet demand and our decarbonization goals. So there's certainly like a delta between, the availability of supply and infrastructure, especially in Canada. So I think, that's a really big question for policymakers and practitioners is, what kind of technology agnostic or technology neutral policies can support, an array of low carbon solutions in the market and have, private companies in the market choose what best suits their needs. So I think that's probably, doesn't answer fully your question, Hung Yu, but it really is like we're in the thick of change and, a moment where we're seeing still an early market develop. So Robert, I don't know if you have any more to add in terms of from a hydrogen perspective.
Thanks for passing the baton. Because honestly, I have to say right up front, full disclosure, I'm not a fleet operator. And so when you guys start talking about different classes of trucks, I profess my ignorance. But I just want to make a general comment about two things, infrastructure and equipment availability. It hasn't come up yet, but clearly without an infrastructure for hydrogen delivery, it's just not going to take off. And so I look at pilots along the way of what's happening on the West Coast with kind of a hydrogen corridor starting in California and going all the way up to BC. But here in Ontario, we're also in the early stages of doing a decarbonization of the 401 corridor. So that, and it won't just be hydrogen, it'll be electric. And right now, as you probably know, Canadian Tire has the franchise for en route stations along the 401. They're already putting chargers in with Ivy, the company that's a joint venture between Hydro One and OPG. So electric charges are going to be available to all the en routes. But Canadian Tire, although they don't talk about it much, and so I'm not letting too much out of the bag, is they're hoping to put hydrogen fueling stations along that corridor as well. So until they make a leap of faith and start putting in at least initial level charging facilities for hydrogen, it's not going to happen, and we know that. So we're trying to work it as best we can in terms of looking at incentives to do that kind of thing. But just as a general statement, why would someone prefer hydrogen to batteries? And I can give you a very simple analogy. If you see behind me, there's a picture of a forklift. So many fulfillment centers here in Canada are using hydrogen-powered forklifts now. And the reason was they went from propane to electric quite some time ago, but they ended up having to have twice the inventory of trucks because half of them would be charging at any one time. Whereas if they switch to hydrogen, they can reduce their inventory of trucks and they only have to refuel it. It takes 5 minutes to refuel it with hydrogen, but it's still an electric truck. And its only emission is water. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a certain break point, and I'm not sure where it is because you know much more about the vehicle classes, that at the low end, if If you're not running your trucks at 24/7 and they're back to the barn at night, electric battery makes sense. If you're running it 24 hours at a time, full cycle, hydrogen starts to make a lot more sense. And so I'm not enough of an analyst to tell you where that break point is, but I can see that market developing at both ends and coming toward the middle. And just one final comment about availability. Two companies, Hyzone and Nikola, are now looking to manufacture long-haul tractor trailers here in Ontario. And what they've done, because the delivery for a new hydrogen-powered truck is like 3 years, something ridiculous. They're now buying what they call lightly used diesel trucks and converting them. So that's an interesting angle. So when you make an investment in a truck, one might say that you're going to get your full value of your running gear if all you have to change out is the traction system. So I'm putting that out there. If Nikola and Hyzone are doing that, I see that as something that's going to affect the market.
You're gonna have to
Great.
keep us posted, Robert, because I don't think hydrogen is yet really in the plan for UPS, but certainly like we're monitoring it closely.
I would say that, yeah, in your position, I would say exactly the same thing. We're just looking at pilots right now. And like you probably know that there's a pilot that's going to be running between Calgary and Edmonton using hydrogen long haul, the Aztec project. So we're all looking at that with great interest. But again, in Alberta, they have a strong incentive to pivot away from fossil fuel, purely, without the derivatives in place. And so there's a lot of money has been thrown at that particular pilot. Also at the freight, they're going to be hauling freight between Edmonton and Calgary using a hydrogen-powered locomotive that was developed because $30 million came their way from both the Alberta and the federal government. Here in Ontario, I wish we had something along those lines. We don't yet.
Next year will be an interesting year as the government may potentially change hands, and who knows how that will impact the incentives that are out there for zero emission vehicles. So the financial viability of these solutions is constantly changing, but hopefully the clean fuel regulation will remain intact and it can continue to provide a framework for different fleets to choose the options that work best for them. So I don't know, Cindy, if that is top of mind for you as well, and Robert, just holding our breath on how things will change in the next 18 months.
Yeah, I would say, we're feeling exactly the same way, and thinking a lot about what that could mean if there is a change in government. Even right now, though, we're finding that there is really a need for policy in a lot of provinces. Robert just mentioned about Ontario. There are certain areas that, again, whether it's renewable diesel or it's electrification or other solutions, there are some pretty strong incentives in place. And I know, Carolyn, you mentioned the federal program for vehicle purchases. We're also taking advantage of the ZVIP program, the federal ZVIP program, as well as the CBP program out of BC. And so that's really supported us on our electrification journey and getting our last mile vehicles on the road. But I think, for us to really build this out in other provinces, Ontario specifically, whether it is electrification, renewable diesel, hydrogen, whatever it is, we really do need stronger policy and incentives in some of these locations.
I agree. I think Ontario is a great, there's significant opportunity to pilot. Robert, you mentioned the need for pilots and for proof of concepts, and we're starting to see the build out in hydrogen, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to bring RNG to Ontario and see how that works out. I believe that there is some smaller projects in the transit space. So, you know, that could provide a good example of what can come in the broader commercial freight sector.
Hey, thank you for that discussion. That was great. The next question is about the average life cycle of the regional and urban vehicles. I wanted to pair that with another question that we have about delivery timelines for vehicles, and maybe if you could talk a little bit about what your expected time frame is for this transition period and how that aligns with what you're seeing about, you know, the ability to get new vehicles, when you expect the current crop of ICE vehicles to retire, and how you expect the transition to move.
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that. So maybe I'll just start again with electrification and some of our last mile. I know we're talking more about regional here, but for us, we do have a target to transition 60% of our last mile. So that is everything up to our straight trucks, so class 6, 7, by 2030. And you know, we're trying to align that as best we can with, you know, as we turn over ICE vehicles in our fleet. I think typically we depreciate an ICE vehicle of this class over about 10 years, if I remember correctly. So, you know, we're trying to stick with that as much as possible, but there is going to be situations where we're going to need to bring in more electric vehicles into the fleet than vehicles are being retired. And then we'll have to, of course, deal with that in a few years' time when we kind of hit that point. In terms of the regional vehicles, you know, I think it's similar, but, you know, as I mentioned, that's later on in our journey. In order is the time when we're going to start to transition those vehicles. So right now to 2020 to 2030, we only have about 25 of the Class 8 vehicles that are built into our plans. But yes, I would say around 10 years is typically what we try to depreciate the vehicle over.
I think for us, it's a bit longer. Longer than 10 years in terms of the turnover of our vehicles. Again, it depends on the type. So can't easily answer that question, but I would say probably between 10 to 14 years.
Yeah, and just to add to, I mean, we do have vehicles, you know, we certainly have vehicles in our fleet right now that are, you know, upwards of 15 years. But what we start to see is that once you get past that mark of around 10 years, the maintenance cost associated with those vehicles is so high that it doesn't really make sense to keep them in the fleet any longer. So that's really the point for us where we're looking to switch out the vehicle.
Thank you. And if you wanted to respond, I guess, then to how those retirement timelines align with what you're finding about the ease or difficulty in acquiring new vehicles, and what you think the timelines for those are looking like.
Sorry, I knew there was a second part of the question. Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of getting vehicles, so when we really started down this journey on the electrification journey a couple of years ago, at that time, we really thought the challenge, at least with last mile regional, it is still more difficult. I know Robert just gave us a timeline around getting a hydrogen vehicle of a few years. We thought that was really going to be a challenging part of this in terms of obtaining the vehicles. We've actually found that for most of the vehicles that we have around last mile, even up to straight trucks, although we don't have them yet, the vehicles are available and we can get them pretty quickly. So it's not the vehicles that are really a challenge for us. It's really the infrastructure. It's taken a very long time. It takes a very long time to stand up the infrastructure in our terminals for electrification. And, you know, what we're finding is, you know, working with the utilities, again, it can take a very long time and there's quite a process involved. So one of the early learnings for us has been don't worry so much about the vehicles. Like, the vehicles are available and we can get them when we need them. It's more around, make sure that you have all your infrastructure in place and you have your people ready and your processes ready before those vehicles arrive at your terminals.
For UPS, we custom build our vehicles. So we work with, our vendors to ensure that if we're talking about electrification, that those vendors are working with us and our specs for our package cars. And so it's a bit different in terms of timelines and process. I would say that, I think we're seeing still some supply chain constraints. And so getting the delivery of the vehicles, before the end of the year to qualify for that incentive. I know that there was a big rush. I think one of my colleagues had to pick up a vehicle or get something sorted on Christmas Eve. So I think, we were very, motivated to ensure that we received the vehicles on time before the end of the year. So it's just a different process. There's a lot more consideration and timeline. So I think that's, if I were to provide, one piece of feedback to NRCan is just, allow a little bit more flexibility on the incentive program so that we, fleets can receive the vehicles and do all the checks before, the cars are plated and ready to go out the door. So the timelines I imagine are different between commercial fleets. Robert, what's the timeline for hydrogen vehicles?
Again, not an expert, but up till now, as I mentioned it, for the heavy class of vehicles, it was 2 to 3 years. So, that frankly, that's untenable for folks like you who run fleets. There's too many things that can change in a 2 or 3 year timeline. So that's why the producers of these vehicles, who have traditionally, I guess, bought all of their running gear from the big truck manufacturers, because I guess what I'm talking about is just standard diesel trucks. They're hard to get, and so they're converting existing ones. And I guess they've done their math, so we'll find out. But again, just to characterize all this, we only see this as being demonstration pilot kind of fleet operation in specific jurisdictions. I don't see a national plan for this. I don't even see a provincial plan for this, other than maybe Alberta, to put in the hydrogen powered hydrogen fueling infrastructure. Everyone's waiting for either the public sector or the private sector to step in, and it's a case of who goes first. But I'm sorry if the message is coming across of grand uncertainty, but a characteristic I keep telling people is everyone who looks to invest into this sector, this transportation/energy sector, they've got a spreadsheet sitting somewhere just waiting to plunk in the tax credit, the cost of hydrogen, the cost of electricity, how, the timeline they're just waiting to plug those numbers in, or they're going to be waiting a while. Someone has to kind of take a leap of faith at some point.
Maybe one other thing I can mention as well, it's come up a little bit, but not much, is around the concept of repowering our existing vehicles. So I know you mentioned, we were talking a little bit about retirement and how is that going to work. And we also talked a little bit about the hydrogen hybrid option and some of the work that's going on out west. So, we are looking at opportunities to use our existing vehicles and either, repower them with the hydrogen hybrid solution or with electric. What we're trying to determine is, is there a business case for that? And at what point does it make sense for us to take some of our existing vehicles that are maybe in the 5 to 6 year range and actually repower them as electric vehicles. So that's another option that's out there for people if they can't get the vehicle that they need, or they're not yet ready to retire some of the vehicles they have. They could consider some of these conversion options as well.
As an engineer, I have to say I would endorse that approach of take what you've got already and see if it's cost effective to convert. And it's the timeline. If you can do it in months rather than years, then I would expect it makes more sense. And just to reiterate, what they're doing out west, they're putting in fueling infrastructure in BC that would fuel both hybrids and pure hydrogen. Again, they see it as a kind of a bifurcation there because they know that some of the early adopters are going to want to go the route you suggested, which is hybrid. And it makes sense. If you've got an investment in trucks, it makes perfect sense to me. And then at some point, yes, if the market is ready, you would convert to a different, more system that's either electric or an alternate fuel, like hydrogen.
You both raise a good point around, having the flexibility and being able to adapt to different, advanced technologies as they come. I don't believe the current incentive program allows for retrofitting. When we look at NRCan's zero emission incentive program, I think, being able to add in that flexibility would probably yield more hybrid options and allow for fleets to take a look at their existing stock and consider what could be another step change.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you. Next question, I suppose, is about diesel electric hybrids. If one of you wanted to just quickly respond to this question, is that something that's also a big part of your plans?
Not for UPS.
Yeah, not for us at this time.
I don't recommend it as a path to decarbonization.
Okay, thank you. And I suppose the last question, I think it's an interesting jurisdiction that maybe is often under discussed in this panel is about Quebec. I mean, the note about subsidies and about wondering if you could share a little bit about your experiences there as well. Where does Quebec play a role in all the fields that we are discussing here?
So for us, Quebec has played a really strong role in our decarbonization plans so far. So for electrification, again, there's good incentive programs and also just support in general for electrification within Quebec. So we have focused in on 3 pilot locations that we completed last year. And this really had a lot to do with where those programs and utility support and whatnot exist, as well as how clean the grids were. So BC and Quebec were our 2 largest deployments in 2023 for our electric vehicles. I think I mentioned this already, but the second location that we're looking for our renewable diesel deployment in 2024 is actually 3 sites in Montreal. So there is some opportunities for us there. Another, just quickly, another solution that we're working on right now is portable charging as well. So we're going to be installing 6 portable charging containers this year. So it's like a modified shipping container. And Quebec, again, has been a great partner to help us deploy that technology.
Yeah. Sorry, yes, Carolyn, anything to add on that?
No, I think that's a good place to end it there.
And I have no comment about Quebec other than they're ahead of us in Ontario.
Okay, that's great. Once again, thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience for the participation, to the panelists for sharing their insights and their views. Please feel free to contact me with any further questions or thoughts. Once again, we'll be sending out a post-webinar survey. I welcome you to respond to that and fill that out. We'll also be publishing a report and case studies on this on our website within the next month, so look out for that. Thanks once again, and have a good weekend ahead.